If you just get in there and just sort of touch them a little bit. I'll just leave them in the water.
Gosh.
So just
For real?
For real. Go on, quick.
Come on. This is so gross.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Oh my gosh. Oh! God, this is getting weird. Okay, what do I do? This is... Gosh, what's going on? I don't want to do this anymore.
Put them back.
Welcome. My name is Genius, and today we'll compare metaship builds with some rogue AI designs I cooked up together with ChatGPT 5. But of course, to bring new players on board, I'll briefly cover the basics as well. And real quick before we dive in, there's a giveaway happening right now. I'm handing out free copies of Starsector. If you're interested, join my Discord and type engineer in the giveaway channel. I'll text the winner myself. More details are down below. Anyways, the fleet is waiting, captains. Let's mess around with some ships. But first things first. Before we can start remodeling our ships, we need to head over to an abandoned station or neutral planet to open the refit menu. Sure, you can also access the screen while traveling, but refitting on the fly can cost a decent amount of supplies and only allows a limited selection of Hullmods. So, if you've got the time, it's simply best to plan a quick stop at the next colony in range. Our lovely trade and refit option takes us straight to the local shop. From here you can either click the refit tab at the bottom at the screen or just fat finger R on your keyboard. Once you're in, things might look a bit overwhelming at first, so let's start simple. Every single ship in the game has a base amount of combat speed, armor, and life or hull points, however you wanna call them. Above that, you'll see its Ordnance points. These points are used to customize your ship with weapons, upgrades, and improvements. Besides mounting weaponry, you can basically improve your ship in three main ways, using capacitors, vents, and Hullmods to adjust its stats. Capacitors increase your flux and shield capacity, while vents help to reduce the flux buildup by speeding up dissipation. So both of these only influence the top bar of your ship in combat. Now if we hover a little bit below that, we can see the shield arc's angle and how much flux your shields generate per second. In addition to that, at the bottom you'll see how much flux your ship generates when firing every mounted weapon at once. If we now combine shield upkeep and weapon flux together, you get the maximum amount of stress your ship will face in combat without being shot yourself. If you're new to the game, don't stress about all of this just yet. After all, this is no rocket science, but ship science. Now, based on the flux values we just added up, a solid rule of thumb is to put at least half of that value into vents, sometimes even all of the remaining points. Of course, the exact distribution still depends on the type of ship you're building and the enemy you expect to face. For example, carriers usually don't need that many vents and can put more points into support fighters instead. Destroyers, on the other hand, often need loads of vents to avoid overloading. And trust me, if you flux out right in the front of your enemy, you'll be completely helpless for a couple of seconds, unable to shoot or even control your ship. So, if you want to be on the safe side and your type of ship allows it, invest a little bit more into dissipation than the total of your shield and weapon flux combined. Now, most ships in the game you'll buy or find come with Demods. These are built-in defects that all reduce different stats. But don't worry, you can remove them either with certain skills or simply by spending credits. Unfortunately, removing them with credits usually costs more than just buying a fresh hull, so it's best safe for rare or decent ships that you actually want to keep. They are also easy to spot. You see, ships with Demods got an orange bar right next to them, sometimes even multiple. And if you're curious, the refit screen lists exactly what each one does. In general, I wouldn't pick basic ships with more than 2 or 3 Demods. But if you really need or want, you can even min-max trash in this game. As it turns out, with the right skills, Demods can lower deployment costs in battle, letting you field an entire fleet of trash at the same time. Hullmods, on the other hand, are special upgrades that grant powerful bonuses like faster movement, stronger shields, more armor, deadlier weapons, and so on. But they do cost a fair chunk of Ordnance points, so you can't equip many. And if you want to make things just a little bit cheaper, you can even integrate these Hullmods by using story points. This permanently merges the upgrade into your ship and also refunds the Ordnance points you spent. So you're free to get more weapons, vents or whatever instead. Sadly, each ship only allows a limited number of story point upgrades, so use them wisely. Spend them on the ships that you plan to keep, not on a junk tier starter carrier. Also, some Hullmods are more useful than others. For example, there's one that increases your fleet's travel speed. That's nice and all, but if you're low on story points or points in general, it's often cheaper to just grab 1 or 2 Ox ships to boost your travel speed instead. A figure that's also close to my heart is the number of people who subscribed. It's totally free and you can always unsubscribe later if you want. If you got a hot second to hit the button, that would surely give us a boost. Anyway, I'm losing track here, back to the freaking guide.
Get in.
When it comes to weaponry, you'll notice that every ship in the game comes with a different set of weapon slots. Sadly, not every weapon fits onto every slot, and some built-in weapons like these lovely frontal cannons cannot be removed in vanilla. And to make things clearer, the different slot types are color-coded. Green slots are for missiles, yellow slots are for ballistic weapons, and blue slots are for energy weapons. In addition to all of that, there are also hybrid slots, which can hold different combinations of 2 weapon types. And last but not least, the fucked up, the chosen, the rare, the universal, the omni slot can take any weapon type in the game. That said, I don't seem to encounter this one very often. Anyway, weapon slots don't just differ by type, they also come in 3 different sizes: small, medium and large. And at this point the whole restriction system gets a little bit funky. You see, hybrid slots are restricted to the size they are listed as, while standard slots like ballistic and so on are a little bit more flexible, since they also can mount weapons 1 size smaller. For example, a large ballistic slot can not only equip a large ballistic weapon but also a medium one. When you're choosing weapons, always make sure to check what they're effective against. Some weapons excel at stripping shields but do little to armor, while others shoot through armor but bounce off shields, so you'll need a good mix. The same goes for fighters. Each wing has its own strengths and weaknesses, such as armor penetration, shield pressure or support. After all, every vent, Hullmod, fighter or weapon you install costs points, and this creates a balancing act that allows for countless builds. Often it's worth to adjust your loadout depending on your opponent. For example, against a low-tech fleet you don't need that much shield breaking, they barely have any shields anyway. Some players on the other hand just go with so-called meta builds for their ship designs and stick to those, but we'll come to that later. At the bottom of the screen you also find a few additional functions. For instance, weapon groups let you decide which weapon you want to fire together. Some players group all missiles in one category, while others separate them into shield and armor breaking. But if you're unsure about what to group together, you can also rely on the auto-group function to handle it for you. It just works. And yeah, sometimes it creates rubbish, that's sure. Next to that, we have Strip and Auto Refit, a very convenient tool if you don't got much time. With Strip, you can remove all weapons from your ship in just a single click, while Auto Refit installs weapons from your cargo hold according to your other pre-saved builds. One last feature worth mentioning is Run Simulation. This feature gives you a safe way to put your loadouts to the test, letting you pit them against almost any ship in the game without having to worry about taking any losses. It's a great way to fine-tune your build, experiment with different setups or simply to learn how a specific ship performs in battle. And to push things even further, you'll need captains. Their skills can enhance weapon types or improve different ship classes, and all of them have different combat skills, similar to those you got in the top line of your skill tree. But that's where I draw the line for this guide. If you want to learn more about Starsector, check out my vanilla guide, where I cover how to start and most of the base game as well. And if you're looking for tips on colony management or item handling, I've also made a separate breakdown just for that. As always, linked in the info card and below this video. Now that we have covered the basics, let's take a closer look at other people's work and compare some meta ship builds with the rogue AI designs I've built together with ChatGPT 5. Now listen, I know that these builds are not perfect, but after all, they are what most players build in the base game. So, like a proud mother presenting her kid a whole basket of slightly burned cookies, we'll sit down and enjoy them. And you'll be glad I got out there and mashed them somehow together with my own hard-earned spit and minimal wage job for you to enjoy with your very eyes. Just bear with me, there are quite a lot of builds to cover here. And if I get something wrong, make sure to let me know in the comments. The classic Hammerhead is a midline destroyer built for relentless forward pressure in mid-range duels. Its 2 medium ballistic mounts are armed with assault chain guns, delivering constant high-value fire that steadily wears down both shields and armor. Supporting them are 2 Reaper torpedo launchers, giving the Hammerhead a brutal finish power the moment an opponent flux bar is spiking. The rare hybrid slots carry mining lasers, covering the ship against incoming missiles, while the forward hybrid slots mount railguns to add precise kinetic bursts that punish light ships and keeps enemies from holding shields up too long. The hull is optimized for aggression. An integrated targeting unit extends the reach of its guns, while unstable injectors boost the speed to keep it competitive with frigates and fast destroyers. In addition to that, hardened subsystems keeps it long on the field, and expanded magazines enhances the chain gun's staying power. With 20 vents and a tiny 2 points capacitor reserve, the ship runs hot, but can sustain its fire for just long enough to break through before retreating. Under an officer with gunnery implants, ballistic mastery and helmsmanship, the meta Hammerhead becomes a deadly knife, fast, relentless and lethal in the hands of both player and AI. The rogue AI takes the Hammerhead in a very different direction, away from precision burst play and into heavy disruption. Its 2 medium mounts now carry heavy mortars, far less effective against shields but devastating once the armor is exposed. The forward hybrid slots mount ion cannons, flooding targets with EMP arcs that disable weapons and engines, while the rare hybrids are armed with PD lasers for defensive coverage. The missile racks drop Reapers in favor of breach SMR rockets, creating constant shield scatter and positional pressure rather than one-shot finish. And to match its loadout, the ship's hull is built for durability. Heavy armor thickens its plating, resistant flux conduits mitigate EMP and improve venting, while flux coil adjunct adds just enough capacity to handle burst rates, and stabilized shields keep it active under pressure. With 20 vents and 2 capacitors, it's balanced for control cycles rather than constant output. An officer with polarized armor, system expertise and field modulation makes the rogue AI Hammerhead surprisingly stubborn, slower than the meta build but far more punishing in draw-out brawls where system shutdowns turn the tide. The Sunder is a high-tech destroyer designed around concentrated burst damage. Its large energy mounts carry an autopulse laser, a devastating weapon that unloads rapid pulses to overwhelm enemy shields in seconds. Backing it up are 2 phase lenses in the medium energy slots, ideal for cutting straight through exposed armor once defenses fail. For missile support, it mounts 2 Subtitles SRM launchers, ensuring it can trigger flux overloads at the perfect moment. In addition to that, the forward slots carry light autocannons for added kinetic pressure, while the rear is defended by a single Vulcan cannon against missiles and fighters. And with some additional Hullmods, this ship becomes way more reliable. Stabilized shields keep the flux manageable, the integrated targeting unit extends the range of its main guns, and hardened subsystems keeps it longer in the fight than its fragile frame would suggest. With 20 vents and a single capacitor, this ship runs hot, but it's tuned for maximum output. In the hands of an officer with energy weapon mastery, system expertise and target analysis, the autopulse Sunder is a glass cannon that can even obliterate cruisers if it times a strike correctly. The rogue AI builds the Sun in a completely different way. Instead of close-range autopulse, it equips a tachyon lens in the large mount, transforming the destroyer into a long-range sniper that can disrupt enemies with powerful beam strikes. In the medium slots, it runs 2 ion pulsers, short-range energy weapons that pour EMP arcs into nearby targets, crippling weapons and engines whenever enemies come too close. For finishing power, it relies on 2 harpoon MRMs, letting it punish disabled opponents at range. Defensive coverage comes from 2 light machine guns on the forward small slots, and a mining laser on the rear for anti-missile utilities. The Hullmod supports this mixed role. Advanced optics extends the tachyon's reach, expanded magazines gives the ion pulses greater uptime, and flux coil adjunct boosts its limited flux pool. With 20 vents and no capacitors, the Sunder balances raw burst with endurance. The commanding officer should be trained in system expertise, helmsmanship and energy weapon mastery. In the hands of AI, this ship becomes a hybrid sniper and close-range disabler, poking from afar then diving into cripple ships with EMPs when the opportunity appears. The Onslaught is a quintessential low-tech capital brick, armored, slow and armed to the teeth. Its 3 massive large ballistic hardpoints are fitted with devastator cannons, flooding the battlefield with explosive flak that destroys frigates, fighters and anything unlucky enough to close in. In the 9 medium ballistic slots, the Loadout combines a heavy needler and 4 heavy autocannons to shred shields with sustained kinetic fire, backed up by 4 heavy maulers to drive through armor once defenses crack. The missile racks are split between 2 harpoon pods and 2 salvo pods, giving giving the ship both finishing power and the ability to force overloads. Smaller weapons fill out the grid, light autocannons on the flank for extra pressure, and Vulcan cannons for close and missile defense. Its Hullmods reinforce its role as a walking fortress. Heavy armor and armored mounts stabilize its massive frame, while expanded missile racks double its explosive saturation. And to top it all off, the expanded magazines keep the autocannons and maulers firing even longer before needing to reload. With 50 vents and 18 capacitors, the ship can sustain its overwhelming firepower even for extended fights. Under the command of an officer with ballistic mastery, ordnance expertise, and polarized armor, the Meta Onslaught becomes a definitive low-tech capital, a juggernaut that advances steadily and crushes anything in its way. The Rogue AI version transforms the Onslaught from a brawling fortress into a lethal ambush predator. Instead of the Devastator's wide area flak, its 3 large ballistic mounts carry hellbound cannons, delivering devastating single hits that tear through even capital-grade armor. Its 9 medium slots are reconfigured into a specialized mix of 4 dual flak cannons in the rear, creating an impenetrable wall against fighters and missiles, backed up by 2 heavy needlers and 3 heavy mortars for raw kinetic and explosive firepower. The missile racks are loaded with 4 servopods, trading execution volleys for relentless shield-breaking strikes that set up the hellbound cannons. Smaller weapons fill out the grid, light autocannons on the flank for extra pressure, and Vulcan cannons for close and missile defense. Defensively, this Onslaught leans even harder into endurance. Heavy armor remains a backbone, while resistant flux conduits improve EMP resistance and venting reliability. Stabilized shields keeps the front arc stable under heavy pressure, and an integrated targeting unit ensures the firepower projects even further into the battle line. With 50 vents and 24 capacitors, it cycles flux quickly, while loading more reserves for sustained engagements. Guided by an officer with polarized armor, target analysis, and ordnance expertise, this Rogue AI Onslaught doesn't simply act as a wall, it lies in wait. When enemies overcommit or drift too close, it punishes them with catastrophic volleys, turning the frontline into a death trap. The Fury is a highly mobile midline cruiser prized for its ability to pressure shields while staying elusive. Its medium energy mount holds a heavy blaster, laying down heavy flux against anything that dares to come close. In the synergy slot, a phase lance delivers point burst fire to finish off exposed armor. The medium missile hardpoint carry a sabot pod, creating an instant overload when the opportunity arises. And to round out the kit, the small energy slots are divided between IRL puts lasers up front for added pressure and PD lasers along the side for rare dependable defenses. The Hullmods also lean in the duelist role. An integrated targeting unit extends its reach, hardened shields keep it competitive against stronger opponents, and resistant flux conduits mitigate EMP pressure while speeding up venting. With 30 vents and 7 capacitors, the Fury balances flux efficiency and burst damage, allowing it to stay active in prolonged fights. In the hands of an officer with energy weapon mastery, target analysis, and field modulation, the Meta Fury becomes a lethal hunter, wearing down shields, forcing overloads, and striking hard when the enemy is most vulnerable. The Rogue AI configures the Fury as a control platform rather than a frontline brawler. The medium energy mount carries a graviton beam, applying constant shield pressure, while the synergy slot holds an ion beam for disrupting weapons and engines with EMP arcs. A harpoon pod sits in the medium-sized missile slot to punish enemies once they are overloaded or disabled. For small weapons, the ship combines tactical lasers up front, ion cannons on the flank, and LRPD lasers on the rear, creating a blend of pressure, disruption, and point defense. Its Hullmods are tuned for endurance and range. Advanced optics boost its beams to extreme distances, stabilized shields improve flux efficiency, and hardened subsystems extends its combat time. With 20 vents and 12 capacitors, this version is less about raw DPS and more about sustained control, steadily grinding down targets while keeping them disabled. Piloted by an officer with system expertise, helmsmanship, and energy weapon mastery, the Rogue AI Fury excels at battlefield harassment. A ship that truly frustrates enemies, locks them down, and enables the rest of the fleet to close in for the kill. The Tempest is the epitome of high-tech frigates, lightning-fast, evasive, and lethally efficient whether piloted by player or AI. Its 2 pulse lasers provide constant flux-efficient pressure against shields and armor alike, while a Sabot SRM gives it the ability to instantly overload opponents when the time is right. The ship's unique Terminator drones add constant autonomous pressure with its own fire and EMP strikes, forcing enemies to split attention and opening windows for the Tempest to strike. Its Hullmods are chosen to enhance its natural role as a skirmisher. harden its subsystems, extends its time on the battlefield, flux distributor, improves sustained energy fire, and an integrated targeting unit ensures the pulse lasers reach out far enough to arrest safely. With 10 vents and 3 capacitors, the flux grid is modest, but the ship's incredible speed allows it to disengage and rest whenever it needs. Under the command of an officer with helmsmanship, energy weapon mastery, and point defense, the Meta Tempest excels as a predator, darting into range, firing sabers to wreck defenses, and finishing weakened enemies before slipping away. The rogue AI retools the Tempest into a high-risk, high-reward assassin. Instead of steady pulse fire, it mounts 2 antimatter blasters capable of catastrophic single-shot damage. A breach SRM completes the loadout, staggering shields and punishing exposed hulls. The ever-present Terminator drone remains essential, continuously disabling and harassing enemies to create perfect openings for the main guns. The Hullmods refines this build for short, brutal strikes. Expanded magazines extend the uptime of the antimatter blasters, flux coil junk provides extra heatroom for burst volleys, while shield conversion front focuses its defenses forward, and flux distributor ensures it can still cycle flux at a workable rate. With only 10 vents and no capacitors, this Tempest constantly rides the edge of overload, but that's exactly where it thrives. Piloted by an officer with strike commander, system expertise, and helmsmanship, the rogue AI Tempest becomes a glass dagger, darting in at extreme speed, unleashing devastating bursts, and retreating before the enemy can even retaliate. The Legion is a capital ship rebuilt for reckless violence. In its meta form, this monster embraces overwhelming forward firepower and relentless fighter support. Its 2 hellbound cannons crack open armor with devastating high explosive shots, while the 5 medium composite mounts carry a brutal mix of heavy autocannons and heavy maulers, layering shield pressure with penetrating armor fire. Around its frame, 8 Vulcan cannons create a defensive wall against incoming missiles and fast flankers. But the real terror comes from its fly deck. With 4 fighter bays, the Legion unleashes a constant tide of fighters. 2 broadsword wings provide flare support and suppression, while 2 Talon interceptors swarm the skies with sheer numbers. Together, they distract, overwhelm, and soften up targets before the Legion closes in to finish the job. Its Hullmods complete the Brawler package. Expanded deck crew maximize fighter uptime, heavy armor and advanced gyros keep it alive under fire, and an integrated targeting unit ensures its heavy guns reach across the line. With 50 vents and just 2 capacitors, this ship runs hot, but keeps its weapons blazing non-stop. Piloted by an officer with Ordnance expertise, ballistic mastery, and helmsmanship, the Legion becomes a decent juggernaut, advancing trading blows and crushing opponents by sheer force. The rogue AI takes the Legion in the opposite direction, converting it from a blunt brawler into a versatile siege platform. Its large ballistic mounts are armed with Mjolnir cannons, hybrid weapons that devastate both shields and armor. The medium composite slots are repurposed for a defensive and support mix. Dual flak cannons deny close-range threats, while Pilum long-range missiles provide constant harassment. A proximity charge launcher covers the forward arc, creating a deadly no-go zone for smaller ships. The small ballistic slots are filled with a spread of light autocannons, mortars, Vulcans, and machine guns, layering personal defenses and harassment fire. The carrier role shifts as well. Instead of brute force numbers, the rogue AI deploys 2 claw wings, delivering EMP arcs that disable engines and weapons, alongside 2 Wasp fighters for surgical strikes against distracted targets. This mix turns the Legion into a control carrier, steadily wearing down opponents while denying them room to maneuver. Its Hullmod supports this attritional style. Resistant flux conduits for safe venting under EMP, expanded deck crew to keep fighter operations running at full tempo, advanced gyros for faster tracking, hardened shields for resilience, and an automated repair unit to patch up damage over extended fights. With 50 vents and 8 capacitors, this build balances endurance with suppression. Piloted by an officer trained in ballistic mastery, flux regulation, and carrier groups, the rogue AI Legion becomes a fortress. Not rushing headlong into the fight, but grinding enemies down with relentless fire, missiles, and fighter strikes until nothing is left. The Medusa, sorry. The Medusa is a quintessential high-tech destroyer, fast, evasive, and equipped with one of the most dangerous mobility systems in the game. In its meta configuration, it becomes a precise assassin. The 2 phase lenses in the medium energy slot deliver devastating bursts that can cripple frigates or even carve chunks out of cruisers the moment their flux runs high. Both the universal mounts and forward small energy slots carry ion cannons, layering constant EMP pressure on top of the phase lance burst. The rare and side energy slots are filled with PD lasers, creating a reliable defensive screen against missiles and fighters. The Hullmods support its role as a dagger. Hardened subsystems extend deployment time, stabilized shields help the Medusa's fragile flux grid to endure duels, and an integrated targeting unit increases the reach of its weapons. With 20 vents and 3 capacitors, it's built for short, brutal fights where timing and precision decides the outcome. Piloted by an officer with energy weapon mastery, system expertise and helmsmanship, the Medusa excels as a blink-in, blank-out predator, disabling enemies, striking hard and retreating before retaliation can land. The rogue AI abandons surgical precision for overwhelming chaos. The phase lancers are replaced with heavy blasters that dump flux into devastating close-range hits. The Omni-mounts now carry antimatter blasters, giving the Medusa sudden killshot potential during each bombing run. At the front, I-rail pulls lasers at constant mid-range pressure, while the rear and side slots mix PD and mining lasers for defenses. Its Hullmods focus on keeping the ship alive for long enough to unleash its devastating payload. Hardened shields provide resilience in close duels, while a flux skull adjunct expands capacity to handle the brutal energy demands of an antimatter and heavy blaster firing together. With 20 vents and 3 capacitors, this ship runs hot and has little staying power, but it doesn't need it. With an officer skilled in flux regulation, system expertise and energy weapon mastery, the rogue AI Medusa plays as a reckless ambush predator, diving in at speed, unloading blaster fire and leaving behind nothing but wreckage before retreating to strike again. The Shrike is one of the fastest destroyers in the sector, and the Meta loadout makes it a true glass cannon. Its single medium energy mount carries a heavy blaster, a weapon nutritious for high flux costs but unmatched in close-range damage. A subtiples sits in the medium missile slot, guaranteeing shield overloads at the perfect moment. The 5 small energy mounts are split between IOL pulse lasers for steady DPS and PD lasers for defenses, giving the Shrike both offensive bite and survivability. The Hullmods maximize its efficiency in hit-and-run strikes. An integrated targeting unit extends its range just enough to stay threatening, stabilized shields keeps the fragile flux grid manageable, and a flux distributor ensures the Shrike can sustain its energy weapons for longer than expected. With 20 vents and no capacitors, it vents fast but runs hot, demanding aggression and precision. Piloted by an officer with helmsmanship, energy weapon mastery and system expertise, the Meta Shrike becomes a darting predator, striking hard, forcing overloads and vanishing before the counterattack can land. The rogue AI configures the Shrike for disruption over pure damage. Its medium slot is armed with a phase lance, delivering sharp precision bursts ideal for punishing overloaded ships. The missile bay carries a breach SRM, less about finishing blows and more about staggering shields and disrupting enemy formations. Up front, 3 iron cannons pour out EMP arcs, disabling weapons and engines, while the 2 rear slots mount mining lasers for cheap but reliable missile defense. The Hullmods reshape it into a reckless but dangerous skirmisher. Safety overrides boost its speed and fire rate, forcing the Shrike into close range. A shield conversion front focuses its defenses, while expanded magazine ensures that phase lance and iron cannons remain active over repeated bursts. With no vents and just 5 capacitors, this Shrike is surprisingly tanky for its size, thanks to safety overrides. Under an officer with system expertise, helmsmanship and energy weapon mastery, the rogue AI Shrike becomes a supreme disabler, darting into fry systems, scattering enemy formations and creating opportunities for the fleet. The Paragon is a pinnacle of high-tech capital design, a fortress that defines the flow of battle. In its meta form, it plays a role of overwhelming beam platform. 2 Tachyon lances mounted forward provide long-range strikes, piercing shields and armor alike. Alongside them, 2 high-intensity lasers keep up relentless pressure, ensuring that anything caught under its gaze is slowly shot down. 4 graviton beams add further shield stress, while tactical and rear-mounted PD lasers form a defensive lattice against missiles and fighters. For the finishing blow, 2 subtiples in the universal slots force overloads, creating opening for its devastating beams. Its Hullmod cement its playstyle. Advanced optics extends its beam reach to impressive levels, hardened and stabilized shields makes it almost untouchable, while flux color adjunct and resistant flux conduits stabilize its performance under pressure. With 50 vents and over 40 capacitors, this Paragon can fire an entire arsenal without breaking a sweat. Under an officer with flux regulation, energy weapon mastery and point defense, the Meta Paragon doesn't chase enemies, it pins them in place and melts them down. The rogue AI Paragon abandons patient beam control in favor of sudden crippling bursts. Its large mounts now carry twin autopulse lasers, unloading devastating salvos that punish shields the moment they falter. Supporting them are 2 high-intensity lasers, ensuring that even armor-heavy targets cannot withstand the follow-up. The medium slot straight gravitons for iron beams, layering constant EMP disruption that disables weapons and engines. Tactical lasers up front keeps the smaller ships pinned down, while the rear burst PD lasers guard against missiles and fighters. For the finishing blow, 2 subtiples pods in the universal slots force overloads, creating opening for its devastating beams. And to handle this aggressive loadout, the Hullmods shift accordingly. Hardened and stabilized shields keep the Paragon steady under fire, flux coil adjunct and resistant flux conduits stabilize its demanding flux grid, while automated repair unit and armored weapon mounts make sure the main batteries stay online even under heavy punishment. With 50 vents and 35 capacitors, the rogue AI balances endurance with brutal burst windows. Under an officer trained in flux regulation, energy weapon mastery and system expertise, this Paragon doesn't simply hold the line, it dictates the fight by shutting down enemies with EMPs, forcing overloads with sabos and hammering them apart with overwhelming bursts. The Omen is a high-tech frigate with one defining role: battlefield disruption. In its meta configuration, it's a pure support craft. The ion cannon constantly fires EMP arcs to disable weapons and engines, while a PD laser swats down incoming missiles and fighters. A Sabot SRM launcher adds real kill pressure, forcing overloads when enemies are already under flux stress. Combined with its inbuilt EMP emitter, the Omen becomes a nightmare for any ship that relies on shields or fragile weapon mounts. Its Hullmods reinforce survivability and uptime. Hardened shields let it shrug off punishment, flux distributor and flux coil adjunct stabilize the flux grid, and hardened subsystems ensure it can remain active in even extended fights. With 9 vents and no capacitors, this design favors constant output over reserving endurance. Piloted by an officer with system expertise, point defense and field modulation, the Meta Omen doesn't win the duels by itself, but it wins them for the fleet by keeping opponents stunned and vulnerable. The rogue AI Omen retools disruption into aggression. Instead of an ion cannon, the primary slot carries a pulse laser, giving the frigate real damage that can pressure shields and finish off weakened targets. A burst PD laser covers missiles and fast flankers, while the missile mounts hold a breach SRM, staggering shields and creating openings. The Hullmods makes this fragile ship even harder to put down. Stabilized shields and resistant flux conduits improve flux efficiency and overall recovery. An automated repair unit fixes systems that got damaged, and flux coil adjunct provides the heat room needed for sudden bursts. With 8 vents and no capacitors, it lives on the edge of flux collapse, but the rogue AI thrives on that cycle of attack and venting. Under an officer with system expertise, energy weapon mastery and impact mitigation, the rogue AI Omen is no longer just a stunner, it's a harassment predator, darting in and out of combat, disabling targets and chipping away until the enemy line buckles. The Eradicator in its meta configuration is a true safety override rush bruiser. 2 heavy autocannons provide sustained kinetic pressure, and a central assault chain gun delivers overwhelming close-range damage that tears through shields and armor alike. Its 5 small missile racks are loaded with harpoon MRMs, ready to finish off overloaded or retreating targets. The 7 Vulcan cannons blanket the hull and tracers, shredding fighters, missiles and anything unlucky enough to come close. To make this possible, the hull leans on safety overrides, boosting speed, flux and rate of fire at the cost of range and endurance. Expanded missile racks double the harpoon salvos, while expanded magazines keep the chain and Vulcan guns firing for even longer. With no vents or capacitors to spare, this ship is designed for one thing only: brutal short-range combat. An officer with Ordnance expertise, ballistic mastery and helmsmanship turns his meta Eradicator into an oversized frigate, reckless, fast and devastating. The rogue AI takes a very different tack, trading raw aggression for controlled suppression. The medium slots are filled with a heavy needler and 2 heavy mortars, combining kinetic pressure with devastating armor cracking power. Supporting them are small ballistic mounts outfitted with a light mortar, Vulcans and dual light cannons, creating a mix of suppression, shield pressure and close-range coverage. Missiles switch from kill-securing harpoons to a mix of breach SRM and sabos, designed to scatter shields, overload flux grids and disrupt enemy formations rather than going straight for the kill. Its Hullmods amplify survivability and staying power. Hardened shields improve efficiency, shield conversion front doubles the shield's arc, and flux coil adjunct together with flux distributor are stabilizing the grid. With 30 vents and 5 capacitors, this version is way more balanced than the other safety override build. Piloted by an officer skilled in target analysis, polarized armor and ballistic mastery, the rogue AI Eradicator becomes less of a berserker and more of a tactical breaker, grinding down opponents with steady fire, disrupting their formations and creating openings for the fleet. The Champion is a versatile heavy cruiser equally at home and support or on the front line. In its meta configuration, it leans heavily into beam pressure. The large energy slot carries a high-intensity laser, steadily burning through armor and hull at extreme range. Supporting them are 2 graviton beams in the hybrid slots, piling on constant shield stress. The large missile mount feeds a Hurricane MRAF, providing the finishing power to overload or distract enemies. Its small energy slots are filled with a mix of long-range PD lasers covering the forward arc and standard PD lasers covering the rear, creating a reliable defensive net against missiles and fighters. The Hullmod cements its design as a beam fortress. Advanced optics and ITU extends the reach to oppressive levels, while stabilized shields reduce flux upkeep, letting it safely operate in duels. With 30 vents and 4 capacitors, it can sustain steady fire without completely straining its flux grid. In the hands of an officer with energy weapon mastery, flux regulation and point defense, the champion becomes a linchpin, softening targets up with endless beams, tanking missiles and creating constant opportunities for allies to land the killing blow. The Rogue AI variant pushes the champion in a more aggressive direction, trading patience against raw burst potential. The large energy slot mounts a plasma cannon, delivering explosive flux-heavy blasts that overwhelm shields and armor alike. The hybrid slots are retooled with phase lances, primed to follow up with pinpoint bursts as soon as defenses fail. Instead of an hurricane, the Rogue AI fields a Locust SRM launcher, blanketing the field with swarms of missiles that shred fighters, frigates and stressed cruisers alike. The small mounts mix PD lasers for coverage and ion cannons up front, adding EMP disruption to keep enemies pinned down. The Hullmods adapt to support this brutality. Expanded magazines keeps the plasma cannons and phase lanes firing for longer, ITU preserves engagement range, stabilized shields handle flux upkeep, and advanced turrets ensure the big guns can track down even fast threats. With 30 vents and no capacitor reserve, this build vents often, but recovers quickly. Paired with an officer trained in system expertise, energy weapon mastery and ordnance expertise, the Rogue AI champion becomes a predator, diving in with plasma burst, disabling weapons with EMPs and finishing off with random bullshit. The Afflictor is the ultimate ambush predator, a fragile spaceship that lives and dies by the hands of its opening strikes. In its meta configuration, it plays as a pure burst assassin. 2 antimatter blasters sit in the hybrid mounts, each capable of punching clear through armor once shields are forced down. A 3rd antimatter blaster fits in the small energy slot, pushing its alpha even higher. Supporting them are 2 Reaper torpedoes in the universal slots, devastating finishers that can delete destroyers or even cruisers in a single strike. Its armor reinforces Razor's edge build. Phase Anchor drastically reduces cooldowns, letting the Afflictor fire blaster and torpedoes faster between phase shifts, while hardened subsystems keeps it active even in extended fights. With about 9 vents and no capacitors invested, this frigate runs hot, but that's intentional. It phases in, unloads an overwhelming strike and phases out before the enemies can even respond. With an officer skilled in phase mastery, strike commander and system expertise, the Meta Afflictor becomes a surgical dagger, fragile but capable of erasing high-value targets in seconds. The Rogue AI transforms the Afflictor from a glass cannon into a disruptive control ship with kill pressure. Its 2 small hybrid slots mount ion pulsers, constantly spraying EMP arcs that disable weapons, shields and engines. The universal mounts carry Sabot SRM launchers, forcing overloads the moment an enemy flux climbs too high. To round it out, the small energy slot mounts a PD laser, giving it a minimal missile defense when caught outside of phase. The Hullmod supports this disruptive playstyle. Phase Anchor remains essential, but it's now paired with expanded missile racks to double the Sabot's payload, resistant flux conduits to shrug off EMP retaliations, and unstable injectors to push its speed past 190. With just a single vent and no capacitors, the flux margins are razor thin, but the Rogue AI thrives on that edge. Under an officer with system expertise, phase mastery and strike commander, the Rogue AI Afflictor doesn't just stun, it disables overloads and hunts relentlessly, turning every skirmish into a nightmare. The Centurion is a low-tech frigate with something rare in its class. It has surprisingly strong shields and serious staying power. In its meta configuration, it plays as a micro-tank, anchoring lines far longer than a frigate should. Its 2 forward mounts carry light assault guns, providing steady damage against both armor and hull, while its hybrid slots are armed with light machine guns to layer the kinetic pressure. A Sabot SRM sits in the medium missile slot, forcing overloads on careless opponents, and the Vulcan cannons round out point defense, swatting down missiles and fighters. Its durability is amplified by its Hullmods. Heavy armor adds extra layers of protection, armored weapon mounts keep its guns stable under fire, and accelerated shields make its already strong shields even more responsive. With 10 vents and 3 capacitors, the Centurion doesn't duel quickly, but it grinds opponents down while refusing to die. Under an officer with impact mitigation, shield modulation and damage control, the Meta Centurion becomes the ultimate Hull's line frigate, not flashy but brutally hard to remove. The Rogue AI version keeps the Centurion's tankiness, but reshapes its role into a suppressive disruptor. The main ballistic slots swap to light dual autocannons, applying constant shield stress at mid-range. In the hybrid slots, iron cannons bring EMP arcs to disable weapons and engines, turning enemy frigates into easy prey. A breach SRM launcher adds reliable disruption against armor, while the rear mounts are fitted with PD lasers for steady missile defense. The Hullmods reinforce its resilience and control. Hardened subsystems extend deployment time, accelerated shields keep its defenses snappy, resistant flux conduits guard against EMPs, and stabilized shields reduce its upkeep to sustain more fire. With 10 vents and no capacitors, the rogue AI Centurion plays more aggressively, firing constantly, harassing with EMPs and forcing enemies to waste time breaking through its defenses. Under an officer skilled in system expertise, shield modulation and damage control, it becomes a stubborn blocker that doesn't just soak damage, it actively denies enemy space and punishes anything that comes close. The Eagle is one of the sector's most dependable cruisers, a midline workhorse built for steady sustained fire and formation tactics. In its meta loadout, the 3 medium ballistic slots mix 2 heavy autocannons and a heavy needler, creating relentless shield pressure that punishes any opponent who dares to face it head-on. 3 graviton beams in the medium energy slots add constant flux buildup, while a pair of harpoon MRM racks delivers a finishing blow once shields are overwhelmed. For defenses, a long-range PD laser and 2 standard PD lasers cover against missiles and fighters, while 2 IRL pulse lasers provide close-in harassment to keep flankers at bay. The Hullmods increase its overall potential. An integrated targeting unit for extended reach, hardened shields for dueling endurance, and stabilized shields for flux efficiency ensures that it thrives even in prolonged engagements. With around 26 vents and no capacitors invested, this ship runs hot, but can maintain its pressure for long enough to break through. Paired with an officer skilled in ballistic mastery, target analysis, and flux regulation, the Meta Eagle is a definition of a formation anchor. Steady, consistent, and unshakable. The rogue AI changes the Eagle's role, trading pure stability for disruption. The ballistic loadout swaps to just 1 heavy autocannon and 2 heavy maulers for high explosive volleys and balanced damage. In the energy slots, 2 ion beams are paired with a graviton beam, unleashing EMP arcs that disable weapons and systems. Subtitles SRMs replace harpoons, shifting the role from executor to forcing overloads and creating openings for allies. Defensively, the rogue AI configuration keeps layered coverage. An LRPD laser for long-range missile defense, 2 rear-mounted PD lasers for close interception, and 2 tactical lasers in the forward slots to harass and maintain flux pressure at range. With hardened and stabilized shields maintaining survivability and ITU anchoring its range, this version focuses on endurance and disruption. With about 23 vents and no capacitors, it cycles flux aggressively, but can sustain its mixed fire approach. Under an officer trained in gunnery implants, flux regulation, and system expertise, the rogue AI Eagle becomes a battlefield controller, not simply holding the line, but actively destabilizing enemy ships and setting the pace of the fight. The Enforcer is a hallmark of low-tech design, tough, simple, and packed with firepower. In its meta configuration, it plays as a frontline brawler. The 5 medium ballistic slots are split between heavy autocannons for sustained shield pressure, heavy maulers for armor penetration, and an assault chain gun for brutal close-range damage. Its 4 missile racks are loaded with harpoon MRMs, giving the ship decisive finishing burst once targets are overloaded. The Hullmods lean fully into resilience and firepower. Expanded missile racks double the harpoon's payloads, heavy armor bolsters durability to near cruiser level, and ITU extends the reach of its already versatile arsenal. With no vents and only 5 capacitors, this ship runs hot, but that's the point. Under an officer with ballistic mastery, damage control, and impact mitigation, the Meta Enforcer fights like a sledgehammer. It advances, soaks punishments, and smashes through anything in its path. The Rogue AI variant takes the Enforcer in a different direction, from steady pressure to disruptive suppression. Its frontal ballistic slots are refitted with 3 heavy mortars for high explosive damage against armor and 2 dual flak cannons in the rear that create a deadly anti-missile and fighter area. The missile racks switch to breach SRMs, less about securing kills and more about destabilizing enemy formations. Defensively, this build sacrifices some stability for speed and staying power. Heavy armor remains essential, but is now paired with armored weapon mounts for accuracy, resistant flux conduits for safer venting, and unstable injector to give the lumbering destroyer surprising speed. With around 16 vents and no capacitors, the ship stats are just tuned enough to keep its mortars and flags cycling. With an officer focused on Ordnance expertise, ballistic mastery, and helmsmanship, the Rogue AI Enforcer becomes a harassment platform, a faster, tankier ship that pushes into enemy lines, gathers their defenses, and punishes overextension with relentless fire. The Apogee is one of the most versatile cruisers in the sector, equal parts frontline tank and support artillery. In its meta configuration, it mixes raw firepower with disabling control. The large energy slot carries a plasma cannon, delivering brutal shield and armor-punishing blasts. Way behind it, the two rear medium energy slots mount graviton beams, steadily building up flux and locking enemies into long-range duels, while the forward medium mount holds an ion beam to cripple weapons and engines. Its missile racks bring a hurricane for devastating finishing power and Sabot SRAMs to force overloads at the perfect moment. For point defense, the ship fields a tactical laser up front and two PD lasers on the flanks, forming a modest but reliable defensive net. The Hullmods cemented as a midline anchor. Hardened shields reduce flux intake, stabilized shields let it hold defenses for longer, and an integrated targeting unit extends its already impressive reach. With just 2 vents and no capacitors, this ship runs hot, but stays threatening as long as its guns are firing. Under an officer with energy weapon mastery, field modulation and system expertise, the Meta Apogee is a stubborn frontline support. It shields allies, disables weapons and crushes weakened enemies with overwhelming finishing strikes. The Rogue AI version trades plasma brutality for relentless disruption. Its large energy slot swaps to high-intensity laser, projecting long-range armor-burning fire. The forward medium mount is armed with a phase lance, adding sudden bursts of precision damage, while the rear medium mounts carry ion beams to flood enemies with EMP arcs. The missile racks are loaded with a Locus SRAM launcher for constant pressure against small targets and a Breach SRAM to scatter enemy defenses. In the small energy slots, 2 LRPD lasers protect the flanks, while the forward mounts carries an ion cannon, keeping even agile enemies locked down. The Hullmod supports this disruptor steady pressure style. Hardened shields for survivability, stabilized shields for efficiency, and ITU for maximum reach. With around 12 vents and no capacitors invested, it runs hot, but the design isn't about outgunning foes, it's about disabling them until your allies can finish them off. With an officer specialized in energy weapon mastery, system expertise and field modulation, the Rogue AI Apogee becomes a control ship, a slowly moving fortress that soft-kills enemy fleets by keeping their weapons fried and their defenses cracked. The Lasher is a classic low-tech frigate, fast, cheap and designed to overwhelm opponents through sheer aggression. In its meta configuration, it plays as a fast-rushing ship. The 2 forward hardpoints are armed with light assault guns, providing steady kinetic pressure at close range. The 3 turret mounts are fitted with light machine guns, spitting constant suppression fire that tears through enemy frigates. For finishing power, the 2 medium missile slots carry harpoon launchers, perfect to strike the moment a target's defenses fail. The Hullmods amplify this relentless style. Safety overrides cranks the speed and fire rate to dangerous levels, hardened subsystems keeps it in the fight longer despite safety override penalty, and expanded magazines extends the uptime on its ballistic fire. With about 5 vents and no capacitors, the frigate runs hot, but keeps its guns blazing. Under an officer with ballistic mastery, helmsmanship and ordnance expertise, the Meta Lasher turns into a predator, striking early, diving hard and cutting down vulnerable ships before slipping away. The Rogue AI redesigns the Lasher into a precise disruptor. Its hardpoints are swept to light autocannons, delivering effective kinetic pressure against shields, while the turret mounts are now armed with dual machine guns, saturating the field with even more suppressive fire. For disruptions, the missile slots are filled with Sabot SRAMs instead of harpoons, forcing flux overloads and leaving enemies exposed for allies to exploit. Its Hullmods push this high-risk style even further. Safety override supercharges speed and rate of fire, Flux Collegiant expands its flux pool for heavy bursts, and Unstable Injector makes it blisteringly fast, perfect for diving in and out. Without any vents or capacitors, this version lives right on the edge of collapse, but that's intentional. Under an officer with system expertise, helmsmanship and ballistic mastery, the Rogue AI Lasher becomes a dagger, darting into fights, forcing overloads and tearing apart enemy lines before retreating back to the swarm. The Conquest is a capital ship famed for its devastating broadside firepower, a true battlecruiser that trades raw durability for speed and overwhelming flanking power. In its meta configuration, it fully embraces this doctrine. Its large ballistic mounts carry Mark 9 autocannons for steady shield suppression and hellbound cannons to punch through armor once defenses crack. The medium slots are fitted with heavy needlers and heavy maulers, ensuring continuous kinetic pressure followed up by explosions. The missile lineup features 2 hurricane launchers for long-range finishing power and 2 harpoon pods for midline kill potential, while a network of PD and graviton beams provide both missile defense and shield stress. The Hullmods amplify this balanced pressure style. An integrated targeting unit extends its overall range, expanded magazines and expanded missile racks ensure the salvos keep firing, while stabilized shields and resistant flux conduits keeps the Conquest stable under fire. With around 26 vents and no capacitors, the flux system is tuned to push firepower at every opportunity. Piloted by an officer trained in gunnery implants, ballistic mastery and target analysis, the Meta Conquest becomes a formation killer, maneuvering at angles to unleash broadsides that only a few ships can endure. The Rogue AI takes the Conquest in a more aggressive and chaotic direction. Its large ballistic slots are fitted with Mjolnir cannons mixing energy and explosive damage, while the Hellborn cannons remain to deal armor-stripping blows. The medium ballistic mounts are filled with heavy autocannons for relentless shield pressure, supported by 2 iron beams in the energy slots to keep enemy systems permanently shut down. Lucas SRM and breach racks provide missile saturation, ensuring no enemy can recover once its defenses crack, while the small energy slots keep their PD lasers for defenses. Its Hullmods reflect this frontal pressure build. Unstable injectors grant speed to reposition and charge in, while armored weapon mounts and stabilized shields keep the ship stable under heavy flux trades. Our shield conversion front turns its defenses into a focused barrier for head-on assaults, while expanded magazines ensure its heavy guns stay active. With 29 vents and no capacitor reserves, this variant lives on the edge, venting often, firing constantly, and trusting on its sheer disruption to carry it through. Under an officer trained in Ordnance expertise, gunnery implants, and ballistic mastery, the Rogue AI Conquest turns from a flanking battlecruiser into a relentless line breaker, smashing forward, dictating fights, and overwhelming anything in its path. The Brawler is a cheap no-nonsense frigate built for brutal close-quarters combat. In its meta configuration, it lives up to its name as a scrappy frontline fighter. Its 2 medium ballistic hardpoints are armed with assault chain guns, spitting out relentless close-range fire that shrews through armor and shields alike, while the 2 small mounts carry light machine guns for suppressive fire at knife fighting range. The Hullmods turns this tiny ship into a surprisingly durable brawler. Safety overrides push its speed and fire rate to dangerous levels, while stabilized shields ease its brutal flux load so it can stay in the fight for longer. With 6 vents and no capacitors, this brawler runs hot and relentless, throwing itself into the fray without hesitation. Under an officer with Ordnance expertise, damage control, and helmsmanship, the meta brawler thrives on swarm tactics, diving into enemy lines, disrupting formations, and forcing larger ships to waste time and firepower. The Rogue AI reshapes the Brawler into a tough disruptor. One hardpoint carries an assault chain gun for raw brawling power, while the other mounts a heavy autocannon for sustained kinetic pressure. The turret slots are fitted with iron cannons, constantly spitting EMP arcs that disable weapons and engines at close range. And to keep the ship alive long enough to deliver its disruption, its Hullmods stay the same. Safety override remains in place, keeping its speed and aggression high, while stabilized shields make it more sustainable than expected. With no vents or capacitors, the Rogue AI Brawler balances on the edge of overload, but keeps fighting to sheer stubbornness. Under an officer with polarized armor, Ordnance expertise, and damage control, this ship is an absolute nightmare to remove. A pest that won't die, constantly disables and distracts other ships. But I'm afraid that's all for now. Thanks for watching my ghastly comparison. After all, the builds we explored should give you some ideas, so let me know in the comments what kind of loadouts you like to experiment with. And of course, to spice things up even further, we could use some mods. In fact, I'll be covering those in an upcoming guide, so if you're curious about the wild modded side of Starsector, stay tuned and leave a like, you fancy freeloader. Also, big thanks to all of my subscribers, members and Patreons for supporting the channel and making new guides possible. Now, if you want to see a name in the credits or support upcoming guides, check out my Patreon, there's even a free tier available. I wish each and every one of you a lovely day and goodbye for now.